Good afternoon, everyone, and you're welcome back after the lunch networking event. Hope everyone had a nice lunch. Delighted here to kick off our session for the afternoon with our Minister Peter Burke, and first of all say, Peter, Happy New Year, and thank you very much for coming to speak with us today. As you know, Peter Burke is Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment. He previously served as Minister for State for European Affairs and Defence, and also as Minister for State for Local Government and Planning as well. So actually, when you think about a lot of areas, Peter, that are certainly very core to what we're doing from an enterprise perspective as well. So, and also maybe, Peter, before we start, then just maybe to congratulate you as well on your re-election and then topping the poll in Westmeath. So very well done.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thanks very much.
So maybe, Minister, we might just move in maybe to have a conversation maybe around, I suppose, certainly 2024 was an eventful year, and I mentioned election here in Ireland, but obviously it was the year of elections as we looked across the globe, and a large proportion of the world's electorate went to the polls. But as Minister for Enterprise and Employment, it'd be good maybe if you could share your perspective of global trade, and in particularly, I suppose, the current environment and the much talked about tariffs, and I think we've probably seen over the last 24 hours continued, I suppose, approaches within the global geopolitical environment as well. It'd be just good to get a sense from you as to how you think about that, how government is thinking about that, and I suppose how it relates to us here in IDA.
Yes, thank you very much, Michael, and firstly to wish yourself, Fergal, the chair of your board, the board, and everyone here a very happy new year. We're all very grateful as a government for all the great work you do internationally. We've had a very good year in terms of the great work that you have done, and you can see from your annual report getting 234 investments, 1.9 billion euro across 64 projects for R&D, which is very important, bringing very significant value into the economy, and hopefully sustaining an additional 13,500 jobs, which will be very important. So I really just want to acknowledge all that hard work. It's very much valued by the government, and one which we really appreciate that into the future. And just directly to the question, well, firstly I would say that we are in a very uncertain geopolitical landscape, and you can see between China, the US, and obviously Europe kind of caught in the middle, it is very difficult to predict the future. And when you talk about tariffs and various different proposals by the new US administration, that might be the least of our worries when you see that the US looking to come up to 52 states with Canada and Greenland coming in as well. So I've never seen a more unusual, uncertain time. And you can see over the last even 4 or 5 years to come through the first global pandemic in a generation, to have the first war in mainland Europe in a generation, which caused huge supply chain difficulties, which put midway through November 2022 inflation heading over 9.5%. We obviously are trying to still grapple with our climate emergency and meet the targets that we have set through a European context, but even more aggressively through our own primary legislation, and then also in terms of the various trade uncertainties. So it is very uncertain. It's something that government is very much focused on in terms of our, first of all, diplomatic relationship. I think it's going to be very key in relation to our connection with the US. When I spoke to Maroš Šefčovič earlier on, late last year, earlier on in December there, one of the key things I was trying to emphasize with him, how important it is to have very strong dialogue with the new administration, because we've dealt with the Trump administration before from 2016 to 2020, and a lot that was said in the campaign didn't transpire. Obviously aluminium and steel got hit hard at the very outset, but a lot that he had promised did not come into the mainstream government. Now he has the trifecta. He has the House of Representatives, Congress. It is going to be more challenging, I would think, but we just have to keep doing what we do best, what you all do for us, and as a government really major on what we have in terms of our most coveted resource, our people. We have a hugely dynamic, diverse workforce. We have the highest third level participation rates in the EU. We're blowing it out of the park for STEM graduates. 8% of ICT graduates come from our graduate pool. That's double the EU average. And we have to keep really pushing on the certainty that we give, the regulatory certainty. You spoke about elections. There's so many different Western democracies that went for election, and quite unusually, the centre-held firm in Ireland, where we got hopefully a new government re-elected, which is important. And obviously the main parties holding firm from a political context, I think, is very important as well, that you have that stability, because it is going to be a rocky road, and we do need stability in the months and years ahead.
Absolutely, and I think, Peter, you've I suppose, touched on a lot of items there that actually over the morning session through our contributors, and the vast majority being from our client bases, have spoke to that piece of stability, of the piece of personal connection, if you want to call it such, and in terms of diplomacy. And as we look forward, undoubtedly, Ireland and indeed Europe is going to have to, in some ways, keep itself to that core as well, as to make sure we keep those diplomatic channels open. And of course, it's not just towards the US. I think it's across the globe, effectively, that those channels.
Absolutely, and that's going to be so important. That's why we have now 9 diplomatic relations missions in the US, which is very strong. Obviously, yourselves in North America have 9 offices, 6 with EI. All that is going to be critical that we work and really ensure that we're doing our best in that regard, because we know previously from the Trump administration, they very much favour bilateral capital relations. And it's important that we are, that most westward point in terms of the access to almost 500 million people of a marketplace, which is very significant, and one which offers very much strong regulatory certainty, a rich talent of skills, and it's very much, to the forefront. And we point that out to the President. Also very interesting yesterday in the context of his press conference, how much he was talking about AI and the ambition to have for energy. And obviously, at the moment, generative AI and the whole AI bundle takes up about 2% of worldwide energy. And that has to be very sharp in our mind in terms of how we go forward with our large energy policy, how we go forward with having the key bedrock to sustain and book a lot of that value here in Ireland. Because if we go on the trajectory we're going and hoping to get an increase to about 37 gigawatts by 2050, 20 odd by 2040, we need to have a solid roadmap, a solid horizon that we can say to those on our large digital landscape that we have and will provide you certainty in the years ahead, because we have so much of the building blocks to capitalize on the whole AI generation, and that's going to be so important into the future. But very interesting in terms of the projections he was going for the West Coast and Texas, and the huge amount of work in terms of data centers that he wants to try and underwrite. It's so important that we keep a close eye on that, and we keep a close eye on it from the context of, a lot of people talk about the energy we're going to have and talk about exporting it all. We have a huge amount to do to try and book that value here, and to work and make use of it for our own population, and do what we've built up, a huge amount of resilience and a huge amount of talent in, and not to lose that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in fairness, you've articulated that very well, and I think that's important for us in IDA to understand as well, at the core of government, that we see about capturing that value and utilising that value in terms of energy and renewables and offshore in particular, I think is part of that. Because when you look at the sectors that we're targeting in terms of growth, I know we would have shared elements of our new strategy, which you have now as well for endorsement. Obviously there's elements within that are very keen in terms of the future for energy is it has to be green, it has to be competitive, it has to be reliable and secure. I think that's where Ireland is pushing towards, and it's great to hear this remains at the centre of government. Can I ask you maybe then in your context, or maybe some thoughts on, when you look at the incentives that other nations are doing, and in some ways protection of policies, how do you see us in Ireland adapting to maybe elements within that as well? Like, do we need to maybe rethink some of our responses in that regard? What's your sense?
Well, first of all, I think it should never be a race to the bottom. There are competitors on the geopolitical landscape that we can't compete with. We have to accept that. But equally, we have to do what we do best. So I think in terms of our challenge is to ensure that we have that capital expenditure. We've about 165 billion out through the next decade. We need a lot more to put into our water, our wastewater, our grid. Arguably, we need over the next decade investment of the scale in our grid that has happened since its inception, because we need to ensure that when we have new energy generation points, that we can get that around the country. Obviously, Cabinet has approved private wires. That's going to be important that legislation and the work continues at pace to ensure that we can have our green energy parks, which are going to be very important through the future. We have the capacity to treble our internet connectivity capacity by 2027, obviously through the Brittany and Cork interconnector and to the UK. And we just need to ensure that we are spending very significantly in those key areas, because that will make us more competitive. And that's why we had our competitive summit earlier on this year, to really, and which you were a key contributor in too, Michael, is to really underwrite and get a framework together to tackle these significant bottlenecks in terms of housing. We have a new planning act which will help, but we need very significant investment in it to ensure that we can invest in our water, our wastewater, and critically our grid, and have a very strong energy policy to the future, because we have so much good on our horizon that we really need to ensure we have the structure there to deal with it and the mechanism to ensure that we can attract investment. So I think if we continue in that trajectory, we continue to offer regulatory certainty. We do know if multinational invests in Ireland, they have a very large degree of certainty to know how their investment will be treated. That's very important. We do know in terms of, we're very much at the forefront in the OECD and BEPS process towards reforming our corporate tax. That's becoming a challenge in terms of obviously where other countries now have slowed down in the ratification process, from Singapore, the US, Switzerland, and that can be a concern on how the Eurogroup really deal with that challenge, which is very firmly on the horizon as well. But we need to ensure that we are competitive and continue to be. Obviously in the 67 countries that are measured in the independent yearbook, we're top in terms of the EU context, we're fourth globally, but our infrastructure is coming under pressure. And I would always argue that's very much the victims of our own success, because we're growing so strongly as an economy. We've seen from the action plan for jobs back in 2011 how much our landscape has changed and how much our jobs have changed. You can look at, when we're talking about, as we were on the West Coast, you know, looking at the cutting edge of technology, and you see through, even in the US back in 1960, about or 1940, 60% of the jobs that existed then are gone now. It's all new types of different jobs, and that's where we really have to be, you know, imaginative, keep offering the best value proposition we can, but not getting carried away, because it has to be sustainable, and we have to ensure that we are really capitalizing on the natural resources that we have as well.
Yeah, absolutely, and we'd certainly agree with that in terms of, you know, we're probably at the front face of, if you want to call it, the success you talked about, you know, of the economy has put our carrying capacity, you know, at a strain, and I think we all accept that. But the important thing is how we respond and the pace at which we respond. I think we're very, I suppose, thankful that government have put this at the very centre. And you mentioned about the competitive summit, which was held in September last year. I think maintaining that momentum is so critically important for us as an agency, and indeed for the economy as a whole as well. So very much welcome the thoughts on that. One area that I just maybe might get some thoughts on as well from you is the area of digital regulation. And obviously in the last 12 or 24 hours we've seen some movement in that space as well. What's your own sense as to where Europe is going to end? Because I suppose where Europe falls and where Ireland falls as well in this context. Do you have a sense as to, you know, from your past experience in this area as well? It'd be just good to get your thoughts and insights on this.
I think it's also a challenge while dealing through a European context, is trying to get the balance between, you know, not stymieing innovation, not really slowing it down, and not over-regulating. And Ireland obviously has always been a proportionate voice right at the very heart of that debate. But it is a significant challenge. Obviously we have our AI Act now with the 36-month horizon, which our department is really leading on, designating competent authorities. We have the CHIPS Act, which is very significant in terms of investment. The Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, the Governance Act. All these are, you know, fast-moving pieces that we are trying to grapple with, all within a couple of years. And I think obviously having Commissioner Mann is very important in terms of leading and giving certainty to our very large tech industries that we have. But I think what we have is that, you know, again, we have the foundation of something that can be exceptional. Like, we're the second largest exporter of ICT worldwide. We have all the big players here on our digital landscape. But it is important to try and get that proportionality into regulation in the EU, and that is a challenge, and I've seen that very much at the forefront. You'd see it in life sciences too, and medtech in terms of regulation, when you're meeting various different clients in terms of getting approvals. You know, people used to go to Europe first. Now they're going to FTA. They're trying to go to the US to get approval first because Europe has slowed down in the regulatory environment. I think that's the one opportunity the new College of Commissioners have. We really need to sharpen up in terms of how we do our business in that regard. And we do know it's so important, especially in the digital context. You know, Europe is very much, I suppose, to the forefront of watching interference, which is happening in terms of the electoral system. You can, see how much hybrid threats have changed now from one time the fear of missiles and boots on the ground to now the interference in democracy. You only have to look to Romania, what's happened with the cancellation of the presidential election because of interference. You look at Moldova, the huge pressure there on. You look at Georgia in terms of the president towards the end of the year and the interference that's coming in. And obviously, Europe is very concerned with that. So there can be a tendency to over-regulate because we can see on our doorstep, in our neighbourhood, there are very significant challenges coming on the horizon. And obviously, we're trying to get that proportionate aspect, that innovation, that we can be agile as a European Union because we need to be, because we're totally at variance what they're doing in the US then, and that's where the concern happens. And especially in relation to AI, I think we have a huge amount of opportunity there, but we need to be able to capitalise on it, and we're obviously doing our very best. We have a very strong permanent representative office out in the EU. Obviously, when we take over now the presidency, which is fast coming upon us, that will be a unique opportunity, I think, to get Ireland's voice across a number of files that are currently before us that we could use to the benefit, I would argue, of all of Europe, but to ensure that we have that bit more agility built into the system.
Yeah, and I was just going to mention that in terms of the upcoming presidency, because I think in some ways Ireland, assuming that we have one more cycle to go before Ireland takes up the presidency, it actually could be a very significant time for Ireland, because I think this, like 2025, as we know, every year brings change. Where you start in January, when you finish in December, can be somewhat different. But I think when Ireland stepped into the presidency, then I think it could be an opportunity for us maybe to bring some different views and thoughts as to how we get that balance as well from a regulatory perspective and a competitive perspective.
Absolutely, and that's why we're very focused as a department to put the resources behind that. We have some very important agencies now in this country, and as I said in my earlier contribution, referencing that we are responsible for a large proportion of the European digital landscape with so many very significant actors in operation in our horizon, and it'll be so important that we have that well resourced and that we can get our story to the forefront and to ensure that Europe is seen to be agile. And that's important when you get a presidency at the relatively early on in the College of Commissioners, because it's important that we try and get action on a number of these files right across the economy. There's a number of very important decisions in a European context that have to be taken, and then we have the Letta and Draghi reports which are before us, which show how important it is to be agile from a European context. How, be it we talk about semiconductors, we're what about 8% of the European market in a global context. That could be 4% very quickly, and have if we don't take action. And state aid rules are no longer the safety catch that was on a level playing field. Times have changed, and Ireland has to be very careful in terms of thinking of the areas we need to invest big in, and to have our budgetary process agile to ensure that we can invest where we need to in renewable energy or sustainability or semiconductors, areas that are going to be vital to the Irish economy, and I would argue vital to a European economy, because we've seen, be it the Net Zero Industry Act or the Critical Raw Materials Act, the various different concerns we have come in terms of the landscape of getting key components that are going to allow us embark upon the transition to a net zero emission environment. And that's going to be very challenging, but we've a lot of work to do in that regard, and we need to ensure that we're agile to do that.
Perfect. I have another couple of questions, and see it's flashing red at me, but we'll keep going if that's okay. That's the prerogative when you have the minister. Two questions, if that's okay. First of all, I think, like we've set out, but we also have lots of opportunity. I think you've clearly articulated that as well, and I think through a new strategy as well, in terms of adapt intelligently, we are going to be doing those things, and I know with the support of you and the department and the government as a whole, we will set ourselves on that trajectory. notwithstanding there will be challenges, but there are always challenges. It's how we respond, I think, is what really sets us apart. But I think what would be useful maybe, and just to get your perspective on as well, Minister, before I come to my final question, is we actually had some of the contributors today, we talked about that interconnection between FDI and the Irish indigenous base. We don't see this as different as an organisation. See ourselves as contributing to the Irish economy, to the communities, whether they're in the West Coast or the South Coast or the East Coast, we're contributing in its entirety from it. And, as I suppose the Minister of responsibility for both of our agencies, we're certainly very keen to make sure that we maximise that opportunity for Irish enterprise. I would just maybe get some of your thoughts on that as to how that's going.
It's a fascinating question when you look at from the ministerial role in the department, when you're responsible for Irish indigenous industry, you're responsible for attracting investment in, you're responsible for businesses, you're responsible for the consumer, you're responsible from all other things in digital regulation and from our space strategy, things that people might even be aware of. So it's a very interesting and dynamic department. And just to acknowledge Declan Hughes, our Secretary General, and the great work he does leading it from that context. But absolutely, it's very important to realise the connectivity. I also remember when I was in a printing company down in Ballinasloe, and their main client was a very significant life science company, and they were printing the little leaflet that you put into the medication, and they were saying without that client, they could close their doors. That's how significant they were to employing 60 people in Ballinasloe in a regional location. And sometimes people fail to see that connection because, when you have a very significant multinational player in an area, that does feed down, not only in terms of taxation that goes into the area in terms of so much employment, but also in terms of services that they require. And it's very important that we continue to link that up. But you can see in terms of the stats that you produce from the idea how much responsible it is for secondary jobs in the economy, the spin-offs, be it from the services that some of these multinationals use, and that's something we should never take for granted. We have a very clear corporation tax code, which is very important. I think we have a very transparent one now that really stands up to any scrutiny globally. I think we have the best international, diverse workforce, highly skilled. That's a very significant advantage. I think we have a very strong landscape in terms of so many natural, green, clean resources that can give us an absolute cutting-edge advantage in the future. And I absolutely know we have very much a centre government of the progressive centre that's very much, and hopefully will be formed in the coming weeks, that will be very much focused on really attracting as many high multinational employers into our economy, but also prioritising our SMEs. And that's one of the things I was concerned about when I went into the department, is that we did need additional focus on the SME sector, because as we know, in terms of your traditional retail and hospitality did come under significant pressure. We have departmental report along with social protection that really pointed that out, as well as we all see in our own localities, in our own homes, communities, the pressure that it's under. So it's about linking the two together and see, as I pointed out, that key example of Ballinasloe. There are many more Ballinasloes round about our country, but it's important that we do realise too that, if we look a decade ago, our corporation tax was about €4 billion. Look where it is today. And when you hear these voices talking or giving out about MNCs or about our digital landscape and the components that are needed to make that agile and to encourage it to grow, we could pay a heavy price for trying to in any way compromise that. So we need to be very careful in how we go about our affairs in the future.
Absolutely. I think it's interwoven, and I think that's the way, and it's interwoven in the communities you just spoke about, whether it's the Ballinasloe, or Ballahadreen or wherever it might be. That's how it's interwoven, and I think we understand that and appreciate that. My final question to you, and it's not a six marker. But what was your FDI highlight of 2024?
Yeah, not a year in the job yet, so that's... will I make the year? What do you think?
I didn't want to go there.
You were listening out all my previous departments. I was thinking, whatever the 22nd or the 29th or whatever date it'll be, what the future holds. That's one of the quite exciting parts of this job in one respect, is that you never know what the future holds. It can change so much week by week. I got it very unexpectedly. I remember being out with the Taoiseach at the Leo Varadkar at the last European Council meeting, and little did I know, in a few days later, he would be resigning from office, and that just shows you in politics, you just don't know from
I
1
travelled
week
on the
can
flight
bring
back from DC with him.
there you are,
and we
exactly.
didn't know either. So.
Yeah, it can make huge changes, and was really privileged to get the opportunity to work with a great collection of people in Detty. I have to say, made great relationships there. It's an exceptional department, very proud of all the work they do and the work our state agencies do, and in a very changing environment. As I pointed out, I remember when first I came into national politics in 2016, could anyone predict that you're going to have Brexit, you're going to have a pandemic, you're going to have a war in Ukraine, you're going to have a massive inflationary crisis, climate action was going to prove very divisive in some quarters. It's so much change you're coming through. But to directly answer the question, I suppose Eli Lilly would be the highlight, because the scale and it's in the regions is very important as well. So that was a very significant highlight, and hopefully if we can get Mullingar going as well, if everyone is listening, that would be very important.
Yeah, well, I have that one.
Topping the poll doesn't come easy,
Yeah, no, so Minister, just maybe in some closing remarks from my side, if that's okay, I'm happy to hand back to you as well. Just to say, Minister, first of all, to say thank you to you. We appreciate it. As you say, you're in the role since mid last year. But just to say thank you on behalf of the organisation, in terms of the trade mission, of your availability to support, in terms of supporting us through our strategy and our asks, in terms of resource asks and financial asks, we very much appreciate it. I want to acknowledge as well as you have the Secretary General Declan Hughes and Assistant Secretary General as well, John Newham here in the room as well, for their continued support and engagement with IDA, because it's a collective, this is a team sport. We're the agency with that responsibility, but we know we're doing that with the full backing of you as Minister, of the government, and importantly of your colleagues in Detty as well. So we very much appreciate that on an ongoing basis. So
thank
Minister,
you. It's been a very exciting time. As I have to say, it's been the honour of my life to serve in Cabinet, and especially in such a dynamic department, and work with so many exceptional civil servants and many agencies along the way, so long may it continue.
Absolutely. And we look forward to the couple of weeks ahead as well. So
absolutely.
I'm sure we'll be talking again. Folks, if you could show your appreciation for Minister Peter Burke.
Thanks, Michael.